The CNN studio in downtown Atlanta had hosted thousands of political panels over the years, but the production staff would later say they had never seen anything quite like what unfolded during the evening broadcast of Anderson Cooper 360 on a humid Wednesday in late June. The panel had been assembled to discuss recent Supreme Court decisions affecting executive power and congressional oversight, bringing together what the network considered a balanced group of legal experts and political commentators. Alan Dershowitz appeared via satellite from his Martha's Vineyard home, positioned in front of his familiar wall of law books that served as a visual reminder of his decades in legal academia and practice. Jasmine Crockett sat in the Atlanta studio alongside two other panelists, a former federal judge and a constitutional law professor. Her setup notably simple, with just a notepad and a hardcover book placed face down on the table in front of her. Anderson Cooper opened the segment by asking about the implications of a recent ruling on executive privilege, and Dershowitz immediately launched into what had become his standard position, arguing that the court had not gone far enough in protecting executive prerogatives, and that Congress needed to show far greater restraint in its investigatory activities. He spoke with his characteristic confidence, citing general principles about separation of powers and making broad assertions about what the framers had intended regarding the balance between branches. The other panelists nodded along or offered mild critiques, the kind of polite disagreement that made for acceptable television without generating genuine intellectual tension. But then Cooper turned to Crockett for her response, and she reached for the book on the table, holding it up so the camera could capture its cover clearly, and said with perfect calm, "It's interesting that Professor Dershowitz takes that position now, because in his own book he argued almost exactly the opposite." The book was Dershowitz's own work from 2 decades earlier, and what followed was 15 minutes of television that would be replayed, analyzed, and referenced for months as an example of how thoroughly someone could be dismantled, using their own published words against them. If you want to understand how doing your homework can turn an opponent's greatest supposed strength into their most devastating weakness, subscribe to this channel right now, because we are going to examine every element of what happened when Crockett weaponized Dershowitz's own scholarship to expose the hollowness of his current arguments and why this moment represented something more significant than a debate victory. It was a lesson in intellectual accountability that resonated far beyond one television panel. The book Crockett held was titled Reasonable Doubts: The Criminal Justice System and the O.J. Simpson Case, published in the mid-1990s. But the relevant portions had nothing to do with Simpson and everything to do with constitutional principles that Dershowitz had articulated during a period when his political alignments apparently led him to different conclusions than those he now advocated. Crockett explained that she had been reviewing Dershowitz's extensive bibliography in preparation for this appearance. Something she made clear was simply part of responsible preparation when appearing alongside someone with such a long publishing record. She noted that in the book, Dershowitz had written an entire chapter about governmental accountability and the importance of robust oversight mechanisms to prevent executive branch abuses. She then opened the book to a page she had marked with a sticky note. The production crew zoomed in as she did so, showing that she had marked multiple pages throughout, and began reading a passage where Dershowitz had written eloquently about how congressional investigations served essential functions in American democracy. She read his words about how the framers had deliberately given Congress broad investigatory powers because they understood that sunshine was the best disinfectant, and that executive officials could not be trusted to police themselves. She read his arguments about how concerns about partisan motivation should not prevent Congress from investigating executive conduct, because all political actions were motivated by politics to some degree, and the remedy for partisan abuse was political accountability rather than judicial constraint. The irony was devastating, because these were precisely the opposite of the positions Dershowitz had been articulating for the past several years. Crockett did not need to editorialize or explain the contradiction. She simply read Dershowitz's own words and let them speak for themselves. The camera cut to Dershowitz's face on the split screen, and viewers could see him freeze, his mouth slightly open, clearly not having expected that anyone would have actually read his older work or would have the audacity to quote it directly in contradiction to his current positions. Cooper, recognizing immediately that something significant was happening, asked Dershowitz how he would respond to his own earlier arguments. Dershowitz attempted to recover by suggesting that the passage Crockett had read was from a different context and that his views had evolved over time as he had thought more deeply about these issues. However, this explanation was immediately undercut by Crockett's next move. She noted that Professor Dershowitz had just claimed his views had evolved, but she wanted the audience to understand the nature of that evolution by looking at a few more passages. She flipped to another marked page and read a section where Dershowitz had explicitly argued against the position he now held, writing that courts should be extremely reluctant to interfere with congressional investigations, because such interference would upset the constitutional balance and would give the executive branch effective veto power over legislative oversight. She then moved to another passage where he had criticized judicial decisions that he claimed had improperly constrained congressional authority, arguing that such decisions reflected inappropriate judicial activism and insufficient respect for the legislative branch's constitutional prerogatives. With each quotation, the contradiction between Dershowitz's published scholarship and his current advocacy became more glaring. Crockett was not cherry-picking isolated sentences, but rather was presenting sustained arguments from his own book that directly contradicted the positions he had been taking in recent media appearances and legal briefs. The cumulative effect was to make undeniable that whatever intellectual evolution Dershowitz claimed to have undergone was less a product of deeper thinking and more a function of whose political interests were served by different positions at different times. The former federal judge on the panel, who had been largely quiet until this point, interjected to note that he had read Dershowitz's work over the years and had always found it thoughtful and principled, but that he had to acknowledge the contradiction Crockett was highlighting seemed significant and troubling. He asked Dershowitz directly whether he could explain what had changed in his thinking, or what new evidence or arguments had caused him to reverse positions he had once held so strongly. Dershowitz's response revealed his desperation. He argued that the book had been written in a different political era, and that the nature of congressional investigations had changed, becoming more partisan and more destructive, in ways that required different constitutional analysis. However, this argument was immediately challenged by Crockett, who noted that the investigations Dershowitz had defended in his book were at least as partisan and controversial as current investigations, and that he had explicitly addressed and rejected the argument that partisan motivation invalidated oversight. She quoted another passage where he had written that some people would always claim that investigations they disagreed with were partisan witch hunts, but that such claims could not be allowed to undermine Congress's constitutional functions. The constitutional law professor on the panel, who had initially seemed inclined to defend Dershowitz as a fellow academic, now appeared troubled. She noted that intellectual consistency was important in legal scholarship, and that while people's views certainly could evolve, they had an obligation to acknowledge when they had changed positions and to explain what had prompted the change. She said that what Crockett had documented appeared to be not evolution, but rather contradiction, and that this raised questions about whether Professor Dershowitz's current positions reflected principled constitutional analysis or merely advocacy for outcomes he preferred. Dershowitz attempted to regain control by attacking Crockett's methodology, suggesting that pulling quotations from a decades-old book and using them to impeach current positions represented unfair gotcha tactics rather than serious intellectual engagement. This attack backfired spectacularly. Crockett responded that she found it remarkable that Professor Dershowitz considered it unfair to quote his own published scholarship accurately and in context. She noted that his book was still in print, was still cited by courts and scholars, and presumably still reflected positions he stood behind unless he wanted to formally repudiate it. She asked directly whether he was repudiating the arguments in his book, because if so, he should say so clearly. But if not, he needed to explain how his current positions could be reconciled with his published work. She then made a broader point that resonated well beyond the immediate panel discussion. She noted that public intellectuals who published books and articles were creating a record that anyone could examine, and that they should expect that record to be examined particularly when they were opining on important constitutional questions. She said that it was not gotcha tactics to point out inconsistencies in someone's positions, but rather was exactly what responsible discourse required. She argued that if Professor Dershowitz found it uncomfortable to be confronted with his own words, perhaps that should prompt reflection about whether his current positions were defensible rather than complaints about her methods. Cooper then made a decision that extended the segment well beyond its originally scheduled time. He asked Crockett whether there were other examples in Dershowitz's work, where his previous positions contradicted his current advocacy. Crockett smiled slightly and noted that she had marked quite a few passages, and that if time permitted, she would be happy to walk through several more examples. She explained that this had not been difficult research because Dershowitz had been a prolific writer over his long career, and that his earlier works tended to be more principled and intellectually honest than his recent media commentary, perhaps because books required more sustained argument than television sound bites. She then proceeded to present several more examples, each carefully selected to demonstrate a pattern rather than isolated inconsistencies. She showed where he had argued for broad congressional subpoena power, where he had criticized executive privilege claims as overbroad, where he had defended congressional investigations against claims that they violated separation of powers. With each example, she provided page numbers and read sufficient context to demonstrate that she was not distorting his arguments, but was presenting them fairly as he had written them. The other panelists had essentially stopped participating at this point, recognizing that they were witnessing something unusual and that their role had become more audience than participant. They watched as Crockett methodically worked through her marked passages, as Dershowitz became increasingly agitated and defensive, and as the contradiction between his scholarship and his current advocacy became undeniable even to viewers with no legal training. Perhaps the most damaging moment came when Crockett read a passage where Dershowitz had explicitly addressed the question of whether scholars should take consistent positions regardless of political context. In his book, he had written that legal principles needed to be applied consistently, and that scholars who took different positions on similar issues depending on which party was in power were engaging in advocacy rather than scholarship, and were undermining their credibility and the credibility of legal analysis generally. Crockett read this passage and then simply noted that Professor Dershowitz had written these words and appeared to have agreed with them at the time, and she thought the audience could draw their own conclusions about whether his current conduct met the standards he had once articulated. This was devastating because it showed that Dershowitz had not simply been inconsistent, but had actually violated principles of intellectual integrity that he himself had identified as important. He could not argue that he had been unaware that consistency mattered, or that he had different standards for evaluating scholarly work, because his own book demonstrated that he understood these issues and had once held himself and others to higher standards than he now met. Dershowitz made one final attempt to recover by suggesting that Crockett was wasting time on ad hominem attacks rather than engaging with the substance of the constitutional questions being discussed. This attack was particularly weak because Crockett had been engaging extensively with substance by presenting Dershowitz's own substantive arguments from his book and asking how they squared with his current positions. She pointed this out calmly, noting that quoting someone's own scholarly work and asking them to explain inconsistencies was the opposite of ad hominem attack. It was precisely the kind of substantive engagement that intellectual discourse required. Cooper wrapped the segment by thanking the panelists and noting that they had clearly identified significant questions that viewers could explore further by reading Dershowitz's published works and comparing them to his recent advocacy. This framing was itself notable because it suggested that CNN recognized the significance of what had occurred and was essentially endorsing Crockett's approach of examining the full record rather than accepting current claims at face value. The immediate reaction on social media was explosive. Clips of Crockett holding up Dershowitz's book and reading his own words back to him went viral across multiple platforms, with millions of views within hours. The image of her, calmly reading from his book while he sputtered defensively, became iconic, used in memes and commentary about intellectual accountability and about what happens when someone actually does their homework before appearing alongside someone with an impressive reputation. Legal scholars and journalists began pulling their own copies of Dershowitz's books from shelves and finding additional examples of contradictions between his earlier work and his current positions. Several published detailed analyses showing that Crockett's examples were not anomalies, but rather represented a consistent pattern where Dershowitz's positions correlated with his political preferences rather than with stable constitutional principles. Some noted that his earlier work had been quite good, which made his more recent advocacy all the more disappointing, as it suggested he was capable of principled analysis, but chose not to engage in it. When doing so would require reaching conclusions he found politically inconvenient. Publishers reported increased sales of Dershowitz's older books as people wanted to read the full context of passages Crockett had quoted, and some readers posted their own findings of additional contradictions. This created a crowdsourced documentation of Dershowitz's inconsistencies that went well beyond what Crockett had presented during the CNN panel. The cumulative effect was to make it impossible for Dershowitz to dismiss the contradictions as minor or as the result of misunderstanding his positions. Harvard Law School found itself in an uncomfortable position once again, as students and some faculty members questioned how someone associated with the institution could have such a public record of intellectual inconsistency. The school's administration issued no formal statement, but sources indicated that there were internal discussions about what standards of intellectual integrity should be expected from faculty, including those who were formally retired but maintained institutional affiliations. Conservative media outlets that had frequently hosted Dershowitz as a commentator faced difficult decisions about whether to continue doing so given the documentation of his inconsistencies. Some continued to invite him, but became more aggressive in pressing him on contradictions in his positions. Others quietly reduced his appearances, recognizing that his credibility problems made him less effective as an advocate for positions they supported. For Crockett, the CNN panel represented yet another demonstration of how preparation and attention to detail could overcome even the most impressive credentials. Media requests for her appearances increased substantially, as producers recognized that she brought not just substantive expertise, but also meticulous research that elevated the quality of discussions. She began to be invited to major programs not just to discuss specific policy questions, but to provide analysis of legal and constitutional issues more broadly. Recognition that she had established herself as a serious legal mind whose analysis deserved attention. In subsequent interviews, Crockett explained her preparation process for the CNN panel. She described how she had spent hours reviewing Dershowitz's publications, how she had created a database of his positions on various issues over time, and how she had selected passages that would most clearly demonstrate the contradictions in his advocacy. She emphasized that this was not wasted effort or petty gotcha politics, but rather was essential work to ensure that public discourse about constitutional questions was grounded in honest analysis rather than in shifting positions that served political convenience. She also addressed broader implications of the exchange. She noted that too often public intellectuals traded on their reputations and credentials without being held accountable for the consistency and quality of their arguments. She said that the legal community and the media had an obligation to scrutinize claims from prominent figures, rather than simply accepting them based on the speaker's resume. She argued that the CNN panel had demonstrated that such scrutiny was possible when someone was willing to do the work, and she hoped that her example would inspire others to engage in similar accountability. The phrase, "using his own book against him," became shorthand in legal and political circles for the kind of thorough documentation and strategic deployment of an opponent's own record that Crockett had demonstrated. Law students began compiling records of prominent commentators' positions to enable similar accountability, and some created online databases, tracking how public intellectuals' positions shifted over time. This grassroots accountability effort was directly inspired by Crockett's example and represented a broader cultural shift toward demanding intellectual consistency from those who shaped public understanding. Years later, when legal historians examined the decline of Alan Dershowitz's influence on American legal and political discourse, they consistently identified the CNN panel as a critical moment. Crockett's use of his own book to expose his inconsistencies had been particularly effective because it was undeniable. These were his own published words, not characterizations or interpretations by others. The moment had shown that even the most prolific scholars could not escape accountability for their full body of work, and that reputation built over decades could crumble quickly when someone took the time to actually examine the record. So if this analysis of how one person's meticulous preparation turned an opponent's greatest supposed asset, their published scholarship, into their most devastating liability, has shown you why intellectual accountability matters, and why we should demand consistency from those who seek to shape our understanding of constitutional questions. Subscribe to this channel for continued examination of moments when doing your homework proves decisive. And when holding people accountable for their own words advances the cause of honest discourse. The CNN panel was more than great television or a viral moment. It was a demonstration that the tools for accountability already exist in the public record. That what is often missing is not evidence of inconsistency, but people willing to do the work of compiling and presenting that evidence. And that when someone does take on that work, the results can be transformative in exposing whose expertise is genuine and whose is merely performed.